Hi, fellow whiskey lovers. Welcome back to another episode of Whisky Wednesdays. My name is Daryl Lim, and I'm your host. Last week, we took a short break from a regular whiskey tasting series to showcase a new corporate trailer video from Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery featuring its founder and whiskey maker, Dr. Graham Macaloney. This week, we're going to pick up from where we left off by showcasing the Peated Darach Braiche whiskey. The Peated Darach Braiche is a unique whiskey, not only because it won the 2020 World Whiskey Awards, but also because it is the first of its kind and the only single malt outside of the Islay region of Scotland to use Canadian barley, peat smoked to 54 parts per billion at its own distillery, a proprietary technology that was created and housed on site at the Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery. To learn more about that piece of technology, go back to my previous videos that showcases that process. If you're a regular subscriber to my channel, then you would recall that Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery was one of two distilleries that had invited me to tour their production facilities this summer in August. Macaloneys Distillery is located in Victoria, British Columbia on beautiful Vancouver Island. The other whiskey distillery that had invited me was the Shelter Point Distillery up in Campbell River, British Columbia. Go check out my videos to watch more of the other videos showcasing the malting process as well as the other whiskeys that we have tasted in this series. So let's go ahead and review the Peated Darach Braiche from the Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery. We'll be covering four areas in today's whiskey review: color, nose, palate, and finish. So let's go ahead and start with the color. You'll see that this whiskey has a very light yellow gold, what I like to describe as a honey pear color. It is very clear, and the fluid, you can see almost the backdrop right behind me, but it is not cloudy whatsoever. In fact, that clarity, as well as if you roll that whiskey around, you'll be able to see its clean lines and it's not oily at all. And for the second area of our review today, let's go ahead and examine the nose. And let's not forget that this is a peated whiskey. However, at that first nosing smell, the hints that pop out at me are actually more of a sweetness. Remember I used the word honey pear? I actually smell honey pear versus that strong peat smoke scent that comes out. You can now detect that smokiness, and it is yet a very smooth smokiness, not at all heavy the way some of those heavily peated whiskeys are. I detect hints of, I'd say, a sweet, almost cinnamon-like sweetness to it. It's perhaps that sweetness, almost as if it's a marzipan sweetness. Again, it's the hints that I'm smelling. Very unique in terms of the nosing for many peated whiskeys that I've tasted. As many of you know, if you followed my channel, that I do enjoy peated whiskeys. So when I first nosed this whiskey, I was surprised that it had a sweeter profile to it, at least from the scent. And for the third area of our review, let's go ahead and do the palate. Now for the palate, as you remember, I'm going to do it in two ways. The first is the short tasting, where I would take a sip and swallow that whiskey right away without letting it linger on my palate for too long. And then the second tasting for the palate. I like to let it roll and coat the insides of my mouth and my tongue for approximately 20 to 30 seconds. Everyone's going to have a different length of time, so there's no hard and fast rule. Ultimately, it's give yourself enough time to feel the oiliness of the whiskey. So that's one thing that I would always like to notice. The second is I would want to feel whether the whiskey burns my lips or the inside of my gums or my mouth. And the third is what kind of flavors pop out at me. And again, for both tastings on the palate, you may actually notice slightly different hints of flavors popping out at you, flavor profiles. So let's go ahead with the short taste. Wow, that has a nice, lovely, almost a dual tone of a palate to it. And when you take the first sip, you immediately taste that sweetness that first enters your mouth. And then as you swallow that right away, you can immediately detect that peat that jumps out at you, that smokiness that hits you at the back of your throat. But it's not, again, like a heavy peat. It's the peat, and then it gives way to the hints of honey and sweetness that I smelled earlier on. So let's go ahead and do the second taste, the long taste, as I call it. That is delicious. Again, among the peated whiskeys that I've tasted in my short career is a whiskey aficionado. This is definitely one of the sweeter peated whiskeys that I've tasted. And the sweetness almost permeates at the start of that whiskey tasting. You can definitely detect the peat, but it's not a heavy peat whatsoever. And perhaps that's what constitutes its 54 parts per million. One thing that is interesting here is the peat and the smokiness isn't burning either. Whereas a lot of other peated whiskeys has that heavy peat that tells you and reminds you that it is, more peat than anything else. This peated whiskey has more of a flavorful hint of, hey, this is a peated whiskey, but there is more of the sweetness to it. And for the fourth area of our review, we're going to be doing the finish. You may have heard me mention a few hints of what the finish would be through my palate tasting. The palate and the finish are very similar. Generally, the finish, I like to let the whiskey kind of swim around my mouth for a while. A few things I'm going to notice about the finish, more than just the palate and flavors, is how long the whiskey takes to dissipate from your palate, or if you're swallowing it, how long do you feel it linger on your senses, on your taste buds. And that lingering would generally give you a hint of whether or not it's a short finish, a medium finish, or a long finish. And I'm sure you've heard me mention this for the last couple of tastings for this whiskey, is that it is, and I'm going to guess that it's probably not a long, heavy, peated finish the way I've experienced for most peated and smoky whiskeys. So let's go ahead and try that fourth area, the finish. What do you taste? Again, this I would have to describe as a refreshingly light, sweet, profiled peated whiskey, and there is no aftershock or after effect of that long, deep burn the way perhaps you would taste it with a Lagavulin or an Ardbeg or a Kale Ila. This is definitely a whiskey that I'd say if you're generally leaning, or if you're more of a sweeter whiskeys kind of a person and you're kind of dipping your toe into the world of peated whiskeys, then I would not hesitate to recommend this as an introductory peated whiskey for you, because it would be a way to kind of gently ease you into what peat and smoke's all about. I would classify this whiskey as a short finish. Short, medium, again, depending on each person. Short, medium, only because for me, I found that the dissipation and the lingering effect of the whiskey, it didn't linger an awfully long time. It was nice enough. You could taste the smoke, and once you swallowed that whiskey, you would have that lingering taste of the smokiness, but it immediately parted and brought back that scent, that floral sweet scent. And again, a very interesting whiskey for me, because it's very unusual for most peated whiskeys that I've tasted. So do share with me your tasting review in the comments below. As I've mentioned before, every person has a different way of appreciating, of experiencing whiskey, and every taste, every scent, I like to learn from them. It's a great way to validate when you're tasting whiskeys, especially in a larger group setting. There are many times where I've participated in whiskey tastings where I would put out a certain flavor or scent that I'm getting, and in my mind I'm like, I'm probably the only guy here that has that, and yet 2 or 3 others jumping, you know what, yeah, Daryl, we taste that too, or we smell that too. So it's almost a way for you to validate what you're smelling and what you're tasting, and you're not alone in that world, and everyone has a little bit of a different approach to appreciating whiskey, based on your cultural background, based on your experience, both life experience as well as whiskey experience. As a friend had recently said to me, the more whiskeys you taste, the better your ability to differentiate whiskeys becomes. So I encourage you to taste more whiskeys, because it's just going to increase your awareness, but also increase your ability to appreciate even more whiskeys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's whiskey tasting, showcasing the Peated Darach Braiche from Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery in Victoria, British Columbia. Don't forget to like and share these videos with your friends and fellow whiskey lovers. We're at about 87, 88 subscribers, and I'm really close to getting to my goal of having 100 subscribers by the end of 2021. Just 12 or 13 more, and all it takes is for each of you to share this with just one other person and have that person subscribe to my channel. We have just a few weeks more to go before the end of 2021. Thank you so much for sharing this journey of whiskey appreciation with me. We've come to the end of this week's whiskey tasting review. Join me next week as we showcase the 4th and final in the Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery series, the Invermally Island Single Malt Whiskey. That's a recent and new release from the Macaloneys Caledonian Distillery, and I had the privilege of ordering 2 bottles from them. Until next week, Sláinte.